Hello and welcome to design number 3 and 4. We're going to take two designs, an arrow and a star, and put them together for a fun design. First, let's look at the arrow design. If you were able to, and I know you did, stitch the 3 lines using the spacing gauge, midpoint to midpoint, corner to corner, the arrow employs some of the same techniques. So this is not going to be new, it's just a new design. Technique very similar, but new design. So let's take a look with the overhead camera what you're going to stitch. Here's the arrow. Again, we're doing a 5-inch square, and we're going to mark the midpoints, right? 5-inch square, midpoint 2.5 inches. We're marking that. We're also going to mark a crosshair in the center, which means midpoint from top to bottom, midpoint from left to right. When these two lines cross, we get a crosshair in the center of the 5-inch square. We're going to need that intersection. And then we have our corners. So we're going to stitch, and you'll see the video, from one corner to the midpoint, from the midpoint to the corner, from a corner to the center. That's why we need the crosshair. And from the center to the corner. And we're done. Let's take a look at the video. So here's the video, and I've already begun to stitch from the corner to the midpoint. Notice how I have it marked, and I'm using the spacing gauge to make sure my ruler is positioned so that the needle, when it comes to the edge of the 5-inch square, the needle will stop at that crosshair position right there between those two lines. Now I'm going to stitch from the midpoint to the corner. Again, I'm going to use the spacing gauge or the edge of the ruler. Remember, we can use the edge of the ruler to determine the position of the ruler, because the edge, this long edge, is a 1/4 inch away from this outer edge. Always double check, making sure as you stitch, especially a long line, that your needle is in the right position. And I'm using that 1/4 inch arm, putting it against the ruler, knowing the opposite side is a 1/4 inch away. And now once that's done, I continue to stitch. You may notice in this quilt sandwich, I don't have the crosshairs in the center of the 5-inch square. I need to mark that. If you forget, all you have to do is take your ruler and line it up with the two lines that you already marked that are 2.5 inches from the corner, and mark the center. So I've marked the center. Now I'm going to do the vertical. I'm lining it up right in the middle of the 5-inch square, and then I'm going to mark the center. That's going to give me a crosshair right in the middle of the square. So if you forget, you can do it that way. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to use the spacing gauge. We're going to stitch from the corner to the middle of the 5-inch square. That spacing gauge or measuring gauge is going to help us position the ruler. And there you can see I put it on the edge of the ruler. The other edge is right in the center of the square at the crosshair. I'm going to stitch and stop. Practice using the spacing gauge. It is your friend. You need to learn how to use that. I can't emphasize that enough, because you will use it over and over again, especially for more complex designs as we go along in this Essential Ruler Quilting Challenge. I'm lining up the spacing gauge to make sure I hit the corner of the arrow. And once I hit the corner, I'm done. That's how quickly you can stitch an arrow. And you can do that across the surface of your quilt. You can stitch arrows all going the same, I should say arrowheads. Arrowheads across the surface of your quilt, one in each block, and make different designs depending upon how you rotate the arrows. Same principle. Now, let's look at the star. The star is very similar. The star is done in a very similar way. Let's take a look at that. Are you ready to stitch a continuous star using a straight edge? Let's get started. But first, before I show you the video, let's look at the finished star and what the stitching path is. I think this helps to be able to see what you will watch in the video ahead of time. This is the completed star. It is stitched continuously without breaking thread. Again, we're going to create a 5-inch square. We're going to mark our midpoints here, 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 and here with a little chalk line. Then you pick any corner. Start here and you will end here. So it's always corner to midpoint, midpoint to corner, corner to midpoint, midpoint to corner, corner to midpoint. You're stitching midpoint to corner, corner to midpoint, and then you're back where you started and you end right here. That's how you stitch a star. Let's take a look at the video. So once again, I brought my bobbin thread up to the top. I'm going to lock a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to stitch straight from the corner to the midpoint. And of course, I've checked it with my spacing gauge, but it's always good to double check. 1/4 inch arm, I want to make sure that I end up right at that crosshair, that midpoint on the 5-inch square perimeter, right in the middle. Again, remember we're going from midpoint to corner. Now I'm going to the opposite corner and I'm going to keep going around and around. And I'm using the spacing gauge all the way through. It's so important to use the spacing gauge. And the first part of this Essential Ruler Quilting Challenge, we are using the spacing gauge over and over again so that you learn how to use it and position it on the ruler. It's always against the ruler. It's always a 1/4 inch arm. So one side, if this is the 1/4 inch arm, one side of the measuring gauge or spacing gauge. I know I've been saying spacing gauge. There's 2 different gauges that you can use that I put on the supply list. In the videos, here you see the measuring gauge, but the spacing gauge is used exactly the same way. We're using the 1/4 inch arm to reposition the ruler in the right location so that when we stitch, we know it's going to end up where we want. The needle will stop in the spot we want it to stop. Each time I am stitching from the corner to the midpoint for the star. From midpoint to corner. I'm using the spacing gauge, making sure my ruler is in the right position. And you may notice I'm only using one hand. If you are applying a lot of pressure downward, you're going to increase the friction, which means it's going to make it harder for you to stitch. So it's light pressure down and light pressure toward the foot that's going to make it easier for you to move the quilt sandwich. I'm at the midpoint again, so where am I stitching? To the corner. Always double checking to make sure my ruler is in the right position so that my needle is going to end up where I want it to be. If the ruler shifts in the middle of stitching, just stop, just like I did. Double check, make sure it's in the right position, then continue to stitch. And that's how quickly you can stitch a star. What does it look like when we combine the star pattern? Remember, I said the star and the arrow are put together to make one fun design. Now, of course, you can independently stitch all stars or all arrowheads. You decide, but I want to give you some inspiration. Let's take a look. So this is what it looks like when we alternate star, arrow, star, arrow across a quilt top, alternating it from one block to the next. And if you stitch the arrow, you can stitch it continuously over the top row of blocks and the bottom row. So you start from one side and you go up and down, just like a zigzag, if you will. That's the technique, one after the other. I think it's a beautiful combination. What do you think? If you want to stitch this design, I've given instructions in the supply list for this 6 placement design. So it's half of a fat quarter, and the instructions are in the supply list on how I made the size of each of these quilt sandwiches. We did it. We finished week 1 of the Essential Ruler Quilting Challenge. I hope you had a chance to stitch through the designs and that you've learned a few things along the way. Let's get ready for week number 2. See you then.